2015, I did a project to insulate part of my basement, and I recorded it, but I never uploaded the video. I think most of the things I learned and did during this project are still applicable today. My current project is I want to insulate this basement wall. Basically, I want to put this big sheets of this foam board in here, and this stuff is about 10 times better insulating than the actual concrete block itself. Seems like a pretty simple job. I just need some way to attach this or press it up to the wall, seal it off with foam, and it should help a lot. But there's a problem. So the problem is if we look down here near the bottom of the wall, we see a lot of damage to the concrete. And essentially this is because this is such an old house and this is a damp basement. Now up till now I've been able to mitigate the dampness problem with this. It's your run-of-the-mill dehumidifier. And it sits here in the basement and it pretty much runs constantly and manages to keep the moisture and the humidity in the basement down to a manageable level. Because it runs all the time, I got rid of the bucket, and this is one of those models where you can actually run a hose off the end of it, which just goes straight to a floor drain. The problem is this house is about 80 years old. And if you look at this part of the wall down here, there's a lot of damage to this paint that one of the previous homeowners applied. And this is because the basement gets damp. And it gets damp because the water is coming through the walls. Contrary to a lot of confusion, and I had confusion with this, concrete isn't waterproof. It's like a big sponge, which means when the ground gets wet outside, the concrete slowly soaks up the water. And if the ground is wet enough, it's drier in here, so the water just naturally moves through. If there's a lot of dampness, it'll actually get behind the paint that was applied, and the paint will come off, and this is the damage you're seeing here. Now, I don't have a lot of problem with dampness here, but it's enough that I don't want to seal this up, because if I do that, I put that foam up here, and now I've trapped the dampness against the wall, and that's just a recipe for mold and God knows what other kind of things growing that are going to ruin my air quality, possibly cause rot and a health problem. So I've got to figure out some way to insulate this without trapping the water into a space where it can do more damage. From the research I've done, the best way to fix this is out here. Dig down, apply some kind of waterproofing coating to the outside of the foundation, and actually insulate on the outside before backfilling again with soil. And as far as I can tell, most modern homes are built that way right from the start, which is why a lot of modern houses have warm, dry basements. There'd be a lot of challenges to digging up and insulating and water sealing from the outside. You know, the air conditioner would have to move, all the sidewalk and the driveway would have to come up and then be replaced. It's just a huge undertaking. I'm looking at, is there something I can do that's not quite so expensive? So I'm stuck with this really big conundrum. If I insulate the wall, I'm going to have moisture problems. But if I don't insulate the wall, I'll continue to have heating problems. There's really no solution. If I go away from the foam and go with something like fiberglass insulation, I've got these fibers that are going to absorb the moisture, and the mold and the dampness problem is just as bad, if not worse. So I thought about this for a long time and looked for solutions. And really the best solution is to insulate this and solve the moisture problem on the outside. And if you have a newer home, it's probably built that way from the start. But this home was built probably in the 1920s or 1930s, and they didn't construct them like that. So I thought about this for a long time, and I looked for advice, and the best advice I was able to find on the internet is well, if the moisture isn't too bad, just put up the insulation and hope for the best. It doesn't really seem like a good approach to me. So I thought about it some more, and I finally came to a realization that this really isn't a wall. It's actually two walls. From about here up, this is a wall that opens to the air outside, and the ground is about right here. From here down, it's a wall that is covered, and it's got backfill against it. And what actually happens is if you look at these two sections independently, you come up with a different thing. This wall up here has a serious insulation problem. I lose a lot of heat through this section. But it doesn't have a moisture problem because any rain that falls on it just kind of runs off, and as soon as it dries out outside, it dries out from upstairs or from the exterior. This part of the wall down here, you can see that the moisture damage is much worse. There's almost no moisture damage on the upper part of the wall. So down here we have a real moisture problem. But as we go below grade, we get the earth actually providing a level of insulation. So this never actually gets that cold down here because it's got the ground insulating it for us. So if we look at this from two walls, this section up here has an insulation problem but not a moisture problem. And this section down here has a moisture problem but not an insulation problem. So if I only insulate down from the top down to about here, I make a huge improvement in the insulation value of this entire wall. I don't lose that much heat from the bottom, but I still leave this exposed so the moisture can evaporate into the air, and the dehumidifier can keep the humidity down. Probably the biggest problem I'm going to have with this stage of it is the amount of alcohol consumed by the masons while building this wall. This thing is just not straight at all. So I'm taking this very flat piece of foam because it came out of a mill, and I've somehow got to adhere it to this thing. And there's going to be gaps everywhere. I looked in vain to find some kind of a foaming adhesive that was safe to use. And despite the fact that there should be something available, I can't find anything. So I'm kind of winging this. I'm going to go with a typical tube caulk. It's not actually a caulk, it's actually an adhesive especially made for this kind of foam to adhere to concrete. But I don't know what the gap filling properties are going to be. So I'm not really sure how well this is going to work out, and this is where the point where you might see me just fail miserably. Now, I'm supposed to stick this up here, according to the instructions, and then pull it back off and let it air cure for a few seconds. I think actually a few minutes before reapplying it and letting it stick up there finally. And this gives me an opportunity to see how well it's stuck and where it's stuck. And it is interesting that there are a few spots where I've got a full line, it looks like it's going to stick pretty good. And then there's other spots like the top edge and the bottom edge that it looks like doesn't look like it's going to stick much at all. So again, kind of playing this by ear. Not really sure how this is going to pan out. So I'm not particularly enthusiastic about this plan. It doesn't seem like this stuff's going to work. But I've got some braces out of some scrap wood here, and I'm going to maybe try to get some more up and let it cure for a few hours and see if maybe it actually will hold. Well, that's obviously not going to work. So there's a lot of different ways I could try to solve my uneven wall problem. And I'm going to start by trying out one of the ways that seems like it's going to be the least amount of work, so if it doesn't work out, I'll have the least investment. Gorilla Glue foams when you mix it with a little bit of water. Generally the instructions tell you just wet the surfaces first so it only foams a little bit. But based on the internet, it seems like if you mix a little bit of water in a little more aggressively, you can get it to foam quite a bit. Apparently that reduces the strength a little bit, but I'm not worried about strength so much. The problem I'm having with this is it basically only adhered at 3 points on the wall. So if I can get this to foam up and adhere at more points, I think the strength will be adequate. The first thing I want to do before I dive into this, though, is do a few experiments to see what I'm actually dealing with before I actually deal with this whole panel and try to put it on the wall. Alright, so we've got a couple of experiments. All of these have been curing for about 24 hours. First off, I just put a little bit on here and let it dry up, and this took about 2 hours to set up, and it set up really hard. It foamed up a good bit. In addition, you can see here that I set a piece on top of another pile of it and just let it foam up, and it actually expanded up to about 1/4 inch and lifted the other piece of foam off. This one was just a real simple test. I just used as per manufacturer's instructions, put a weight on top of it to give it a little bit of clamping force, and it didn't foam up enough to actually move the piece. But the important thing I was looking for here is it didn't damage the foam in any way, which it's not supposed to, but I thought I'd just double make sure. This one I didn't show you before, but what I did was I put a couple of pieces of wood here as a spacer, and then just put the pile and then set this on so it wasn't actually touching when I initially set it off. So it actually expanded to fill the gap and adhered to two pieces of foam. And a little bit to try to break this apart, and it actually took a good bit of force to break apart there. So I think this is going to work. So I've taken the time to clean all the adhesive off the wall from my previous attempt, or at least most of it. And I've also gone, if you can see the red marks, I've gone into the trouble of trying to figure out what parts of the wall are high enough that they were contacting the foam. And as you can see, it's not very much. But using a straight edge and a piece of foam to kind of look behind it and find out, I've determined these spots, and I've gone to a lot of trouble to clean those up as much as possible, because some of the problems I had was with the paint coming off before. But these are the sections I'm going to apply the adhesive to, and hopefully these few sections will be enough to actually adhere it. But you can see just how crooked the wall really is here. The tricky part now is to see if I can get this stuff to actually stick to the wall. So the glue's been curing for about 3 hours. In my previous test, it took about 2 hours for it to cure as far as it looked like it was going to. So this should be done even if the circulation isn't as good. That is going to stay. So now we have a system. Now I just have to do the rest of the wall. So if you bother to watch this the whole way through to the end, you're probably asking yourself, how did it work out? And I can tell you that everything stayed up well. It's been almost 3 years. I haven't had any problem with anything falling down or any problems with that. But the problem is was it worth it? It's really hard to tell. Here in Pennsylvania, the winters are not real consistent. Some of them are much colder than others. Also, when I'm not at home, I turn the heat down, so depending on how often I'm home, I might use more or less heating. So I can't really just look at my heating bill to tell if it made a big difference. It does feel like, put your hand on the wall here, on the foam, and it feels room temperature, whereas down here it still feels a little cold. And if I touch some of the places where it's not insulated, it feels a lot cold. That doesn't really prove anything, and it also doesn't say how much of a difference it made. So that's the problem with doing something when you're not in a laboratory, is you really don't know if it worked out. I like to think that it did, but I can't really say for sure. And anyway, I hope someone finds this useful, at least the techniques that I had to use to make it happen.